Should you hate feminism? Sargon of Akkad reckons the answer is yes, and he's produced 13, or 15 depending on who's counting, videos to provide a comprehensive explanation of all the top reasons you should hate feminism. And to be honest, this is the kind of thing I love. Comprehensive summations of larger positions, argument by argument. Because in general, most videos on YouTube are just spur-of-the-moment things. There's rarely any structure to them, but once in a while somebody will make a series which touts itself as a comprehensive argument for a given position. In this case, this series comprises Sargon's comprehensive argument for why people should hate feminism, why feminism is worthy of hate. So I figured I'd do a counter-series responding to him. This is part 2 of the series, but you really don't need to watch part 1, since the videos don't really build on each other. You should watch part 1 if you haven't already, because Sargon made a lot of bad points that were entertaining to respond to. Although, if you like bad points being responded to, then this video will scratch that itch also. So, last time the claim was that feminists hate men, but today the claim is the patriarchy. Well, that isn't the claim, but we can assume there's an implied is bullshit on the end there. Right, so the patriarchy. Let's jump in.
The patriarchy.
You jest, but let's not forget that patriarch comes from the Latin pater, meaning father, and Jesus says in Matthew 23:9 not to call any man your father. So I don't think that you shouldn't be triggered by these bozos calling themselves patriarchs. But moving on.
Before we can go any further, we need to define our terms.
I agree, yes. We can start off on a moment of agreement. We need to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what feminists mean when they talk about the patriarchy.
Now, any normal person would probably go and look for the standard English definition. So when a feminist says to the uninitiated that we live in a patriarchy, they're thinking that a patriarchy is a form of social organisation in which the father is the supreme authority in the family, clan or tribe, and descent is reckoned in the male line, with the children belonging to the father's clan or tribe. So when the average person returns to their definition of patriarchy as a form of social organisation in which the father is the supreme authority in the family, clan or tribe, and descent is reckoned in the male line, with children belonging to the father's clan or tribe, they're wondering, what the fuck are feminists talking about?
Okay, so I have a confession. When I first saw this, I thought it was going to go something like this. The average person would just turn to the dictionary, then they'd see lots of stuff that appears to contradict the dictionary definition, then they'd turn to a more academic definition of feminism. I don't know why I expected that of Sargon. I was genuinely expecting him to whip out some kind of foundational feminist literature and provide the definition of patriarchy presented there, but he doesn't. Believe me, he doesn't. You see, in academic discussions, an appeal to the dictionary is very frowned upon, because a dictionary simply tells you how a word is used by the average person. It doesn't tell you the definition of the term as understood by academics. The meaning of words over time evolve in colloquial conversations and also in academic conversations. That's why you'll often end up with 2 different definitions for words that have some academic significance. A non-academic definition also doesn't necessarily provide the most coherent or comprehensive definition, since again, that isn't a priority of the average person. This is why if you want a definition of patriarchy, you're best off going to somebody who has written multiple books on gender and spent significant amounts of time honing their understanding of these concepts to take account of the literature, both critical and complementary, on their position. Such a person would be a feminist academic. But anyway, let's go through the actual reasons Sargon gives to show that patriarchy don't reel. Don't worry, I wasn't going to just fast forward through them.
The first thing that they're going to discover is that marriage rates are sharply on the decline. Young people are simply not getting married. The next thing they'll discover is that over a quarter of families are single-parent households. And the overwhelming majority of these households, over 2/3 of them, will be led by single mothers.
So he starts off working with this very literal understanding of patriarchy. The patriarch is the head of the household through marriage, but people aren't getting married anymore, therefore patriarchy doesn't exist. Of course, actual feminists have moved past this strict familial definition of patriarchy. First, I want to look at the opening by Sylvia Walby to her book Theorizing Patriarchy. As you can see, she starts off by saying it would be surprising if developing theories of patriarchy did not use the terms in slightly different ways. This is funny since one of Sargon's big arguments is going to be that feminists have a variety of different definitions of the patriarchy, as if that's supposed to be something feminists should have an issue with. Not to say that some feminists don't have issues with it, but it's not a worldview breaking issue. She then goes on to say,
Yet, the practice of incorporating a generational element into the definition of patriarchy has been continued by some of the major contemporary writers on this question, most importantly by Hartman. I think that the incorporation of a generational element into the definition is a mistake. It implies a theory of gender inequality in which this aspect of men's domination over each other is central to men's domination over women. Yet, in practice, few contemporary theories of gender inequality establish that this is the case. For instance, while Hartman uses a definition which incorporates generational hierarchy among men, this is not central to her theory of patriarchy, which focuses upon men's organizational ability to expropriate women's labor in paid work and hence in the household.
So here we have a feminist saying that she thinks that generational use of the term to describe the role of the father in the family is limited in its utility, and rejected by most modern feminists. Would have been a useful thing for Sargon to read before he acted as if that was a popular definition. Barrett further criticises the idea of a father-centred understanding of patriarchy in her book Women's Oppression Today.
This difficulty lies in a confusion as to whether patriarchy refers to the dominance of men over women, or the role of the father as such. This ambiguity as to the referent of the concept of patriarchy is a serious one. Although the concept may well describe forms of social organization in which economic and social power is vested in the father as such, it is not necessarily a helpful concept with which to explore the oppression of women in capitalist societies.
Like I promised, this is an example of a feminist who says the unclear meaning of patriarchy is an issue, and of course to an extent it is, but I definitely disagree that it is a serious issue. Barrett, incidentally, provides an example of the alternative point of view, the generational understanding of patriarchy earlier on in the chapter.
Gail Rubin, for instance, makes the fruitful suggestion that the term patriarchy would be a more valuable one if its use were restricted to societies, and here she cites the nomadic tribes of Abraham's era, where one man wielded absolute power through a socially defined institution of fatherhood. Similarly, it would be possible to argue for a use of the term to describe the ideological aspects of relationships that are predicated on the paradigm, for instance, of a father-daughter relationship.
Sorry I'm not quoting Rubin directly, but I have never read the cited work before, which is her chapter The Traffic in Women in the book Towards a Female Anthropology, but I suspect that this quotation is a more concise account of Rubin's views than I might have otherwise found. However, this does give me a good opportunity to bring up the fact that many feminist works will start off by bringing up a variety of different definitions of patriarchy from various theorists, so you don't even need to have lots of feminist literature for multiple definitions of patriarchy to inform your understanding of the broader term. For example, if you keep reading Barrett's work, you can find this definition.
McDonough and Harrison regard patriarchy as requiring a twofold definition. First, the control of women's fertility and sexuality in monogamous marriage, and second, the economic subordination of women through the sexual division of labor and property. They argue that the patriarchal family as such has been eliminated, but that patriarchy can be said to exist at present in the operation of these two processes.
Again, if Sargon actually bothered to engage feminist theory, he'd at least be aware of the nuance behind using the term patriarchy in this way. It's also worth noting that without social context, a family dominated by the husband and father isn't a bad thing. The problem only emerges when this comes to define a family as a unit of society. But ignoring all of this, Sargon is claiming that the fact that women get custody of the kids is somehow clear evidence that we don't live in a patriarchy. Now again, this would be true if we accept that rigid definition that very few feminists accept, and I suspect no feminists accept as rigidly as it could be. However, Sargon concedes that the time before women were allowed to vote was a genuinely patriarchal time, and I hope he's aware that one of the presumed duties of women at that time was taking care of the children. So clearly, women taking care of most of the children as single mothers is not evidence against the fact that we live in a patriarchy. Sargon then does something bizarre. He lists a load of important metrics for determining power and influence, and shows how women have proportionally less representation in these areas.
They'll probably also discover that women control approximately 20% of the US government. The number of Fortune 500 companies that have women CEOs is higher than it's ever been. 24 female CEOs make up 4.8% of the overall total, and running 40% of all private American businesses.
And this is supposed to be his evidence against the patriarchy? Seriously, his evidence against the existence of the patriarchy is a series of statistics that show how women have less power and influence than men. The private business figure isn't even meaningful, because a private business could be selling charm bracelets on Facebook. Indeed, the fact that women control a significant number of private businesses is arguably an argument for the existence of patriarchy, since private businesses could be born out of the fact that women struggle to find jobs. Now, I'm not saying this is the case. I'm not saying that a significant proportion of those private businesses are small household businesses, but that seems very likely. So we're left with women controlling less than half of private businesses, and there is a very good chance that a lot of those businesses are run out of a household, which means we're dealing with women who are essentially stay-at-home mums, and this is being used as an argument against the existence of a patriarchy.
With over 1.3 million women earning over $100,000 plus annually.
And this doesn't mean anything, since there isn't even a percentage given. I suspect the percentage wouldn't be very high. I'm sure more than 2.6 million people in the US earn more than $100,000 a year. So after this, you're only left with the fact that
women control the money in the United States, holding 60% of all personal wealth and 51% of all stocks.
Now, first things first, I wanted to look around to see if I could find anything interesting about these statistics, and I couldn't find a single other article claiming that women currently control 60% of personal wealth, never mind in 2012. I could, however, find articles contradicting it, such as this more recent article claiming American women control 51.3% of wealth. However, there is something which significantly mitigates women's control over personal finances and stocks. Women make up over half the US population, and what's more, women tend to live longer than men. While more male babies are born than female babies, fun fact, babies don't control much personal wealth. So men are overrepresented amongst babies who control very little wealth, while women are overrepresented amongst old people who have an entire lifetime of accrued wealth. And then there's the whole baby boomer thing, where baby boomers are loaded relative to other generations. One wonders how things will work out for women when the elderly stop being so disproportionately better off. But still, we'll say that this is an example of where women are doing better than or equal to men. At least until I have the time and resources to do a proper analysis into women's personal wealth. That's one area, and I'm happy to concede that one area as an example of where women are doing alright, when Sargon has already conceded 3 more important areas where women are grossly underrepresented.
Women control the household finances as well, with women making 75 to 78% of household purchases as of 2009.
He must have known how stupid this was to make as a claim. Of course women make the majority of household purchases. That was the case in the 50s as well. You know why? Because going shopping is unpaid labour. I pay £1 to have my groceries delivered because I don't want to go out and get them myself. It's much quicker to quickly search for what I want online and make an online grocery order than it is to search around for the shop for what I want to buy. And that's not even factoring in the effort of going there. So no, making a large number of household purchases is not an enviable position. It's, in my opinion, one of the more tedious forms of unpaid domestic labour going, shopping for groceries. So clearly that argument is abysmally stupid. It seems like Sargon's argument here is based on the understanding of patriarchy as being very family-centred. In other words, since women control spending in the family, patriarchy doesn't exist. Of course, in reality, this understanding of patriarchy has been contended by feminists for a long time now, and in a modern setting seems to not exist at all. It's also worth noting that even if we ignore household purchasing, that still doesn't prove anything. I really don't spend any money at all. By contrast, my sister spends quite a bit of money. But this has nothing to do with power. Indeed, the number one item that seems to make a difference between me, who hardly buys anything, and a lot of women, who in my view seem to throw a lot of money away, is that women buy cosmetics products. Why? Because of patriarchal beauty standards. I'm very happy that I don't feel any obligation to purchase frivolous things because society hasn't communicated to me that it's necessary to buy anything that serves to enhance my attractiveness. Indeed, conversely, in the case of men, it is how much they earn, a meaningful reflection of their actual power and social clout, that determines their value to the opposite sex. It seems that the reason women spend more than men is not due to men having a lack of funds, but rather men more often having no compulsion to buy things. And that lack of compulsion is born out of the fact that men aren't expected to spend anything like as much money beautifying themselves as women are. There's also the fact that in the case of a lot of unnecessarily gendered products, the women's version actually costs more than the male version for no real reason. So that would explain why women spend more money on purchases. It has nothing to do with women having more power, but rather quite the opposite. Now, all of that was sort of surrounded by the overarching point that you shouldn't use dictionary definitions when making serious critiques of an ideology. You should find an academic source advocating for the position you're arguing against and use the definition they provide. Otherwise, you're just using a dictionary that tells us nothing other than how the word is generally used, ignoring the fact that academic uses and colloquial uses of a word may evolve separately. But believe it or not, it gets worse, because next Sargon shows some random woman doing a TED talk explaining what the patriarchy is.
Patriarchy.
Like me, you're probably confused as to what this clearly privileged woman is talking about. Patriarchy is her husband cheating on her, I think.
I am confused about what this woman is talking about. Who is she? What are her credentials? What has she published? Why even bring her up if you hardly have anything to say about her? Why post such an obnoxiously long clip of her talking? Why do you always do this?
That feminists blame everything on patriarchy.
and that people think that that's false and that they can't blame everything on patriarchy and that's just their fallback, that they just go to that and you can't ever argue with them because it's always about patriarchy. You can't argue that. So I'm going to try to actually defend these feminists and say that basically, yeah, everything kind of can be blamed on the patriarchy.
Okay, so he doesn't actually show a definition being given here, and then he goes on to say...
Okay, so patriarchy seems to have a subjective definition for each feminist who is using it.
So far he has shown one definition of patriarchy as given by a feminist, which he himself admitted was so utterly incoherent that he didn't even have anything to say about it. And now he has shown a woman not defining the patriarchy at all, and said this shows how the term patriarchy is totally dependent on the particular feminist using it. Now, I don't want to imply that if Sargon were able to find two feminists who give conflicting definitions of patriarchy, that would prove some meaningful point. Lots of academics disagree on definitions. There's an entire debate within epistemology about what the definition of knowledge should be. That doesn't mean anything apart from most academics tend to deal with difficult points that are hard to understand, and therefore different academics will tend to prefer different definitions. There is not even the beginnings of a point here from Sargon.
Everything in society can be blamed on the quote-unquote patriarchy.
I suspect if this woman were to construct a working definition, she'd probably either expand upon, qualify, or drop the claim that everything can be blamed on patriarchy. She was probably broadly referring to everything as pertains to women's oppression. Thing is, we don't know how she defined patriarchy if she actually tried to give the best definition she could, because Sargon hasn't shown her defining patriarchy. He's just taken a seemingly unscripted introductory remark from a woman who looks rather young, like she might just be beginning to explore feminist ideas, and made his argument based on that.
Patriarchy is essentially this idea that men have the power in society.
So this isn't a bad definition. Sargon doesn't really say anything meaningful in response to it. He says that this isn't in keeping with the dictionary definition, which doesn't matter at all. He also says this definition raises more questions, which is true of most definitions dealing with complex issues, so not sure what point he's trying to make there. In keeping with this definition, you can find in Women's Oppression Today, Kate Millett's understanding of patriarchy as an overarching category of male dominance, a pretty simple but effective definition, and yes, one that opens up a lot of questions in itself. Again, that isn't an issue.
So at this point, we are 6.5 minutes into this video, and we are still not really sure what feminists are talking about when they're talking about patriarchy.
You realise you're the one who made this video, right? Usually this is something you'd say about somebody else's video. Like I might say, we're 6.5 minutes into this video and Sargon hasn't given us any reason to think that we don't live in a patriarchy. And if I made that criticism, that's a criticism of you. You are the one who has poorly constructed this video. And yes, that's why we're 6.5 minutes into this video and you still haven't made a meaningful point. Because you scripted this video. You decided to show long unedited clips of random women on YouTube talking. That's not my fault. That's not feminism's fault. A feminist probably would have told you to read a book. 6.5 minutes is a long time. You could have spent this time just going through some popular, well-regarded feminist literature, showing the definitions there, and drawing out some of the wider implications of what the term patriarchy means to feminists in general. Just get educated and throw out a handful of definitions and work from there, rather than making a whole video where you refuse to go to the most obvious source for information about feminism, and then say, well, feminism just doesn't make any sense. Indeed, if I were called upon to give a definition of patriarchy, I'd probably give this one from Gerda Lerner's The Creation of Patriarchy.
Patriarchy, in its wider definition, means the manifestation and institutionalization of male dominance over women and children in the family, and the extension of male dominance over women in society in general. It implies that men hold power in all the important institutions of society, and that women are deprived of access to such power. It does not imply that women are either totally powerless or totally deprived of rights, influence, and resources. One of the most challenging tasks of women's history is to trace with precision the various forms and modes in which patriarchy appears historically, the shifts and changes in its structure and function, and the adaptations it makes to female pressure and demands.
More on that definition later, but if Sargon didn't want to actually read the literature of the movement he's dedicated much of his adult life to arguing against, he could always just Google academic definitions of patriarchy. Side note, something I was thinking would be really useful is like an academic definition site, where it would basically contain all of the different definitions of different concepts offered by different academics, and sort of organize similar definitions together. It would make it much easier to have academic discussions because you could just type a term into the search bar and find out the types of definitions that are used by academics. Anyway, funnily enough, one of the first definitions that I found was by J. Ann Tickner, which is funny because in my last video on Sargon, I complained that he doesn't engage with feminist academia on international relations theory, which annoyed me in particular because that's what my university education was in. And of course, J. Ann Tickner is a famous feminist international relations theorist, and it refers to her contribution to the Routledge Encyclopedia of International Political Economy, which reads,
"The literal and historical meaning of patriarchy is the rule of fathers. Although there is no consensus on the contemporary definition of the term, many feminists have extended it beyond the realm of the family to include the rule of men over women more generally. Patriarchy, so defined, encompasses all systems of male dominance. Most feminists outside the liberal tradition claim that men dominate women through a variety of political, economic, and social structures that vary across time and place. Since patriarchy is not seen as a universal state, but as a social construction, feminists believe that it can be overcome. Therefore, revealing and critically analyzing the patriarchy's various manifestations can contribute to ending it."
Ironically, this definition would have helped Sargon in many ways. It admits that the definition is disputed amongst feminists, although deleterious, am I ever going to get that right? Although deleterious? I feel like I've only ever read that word. Although deleterious, it doesn't sound right at all, does it? Let's look it up. Deleterious pronunciation. Deleterious, okay. Although deleterious to Sargon's argument is the fact that it is not treated... Oh, fucking hell, I fucked that up and I don't want to read that word again. Although deleterious to Sargon's argument is the fact that this is not treated like something which seriously compromises the conceptual integrity of the term, but rather as something which one naturally expects from such a broad body as academic feminism. It also deals again with the question of whether feminism should be understood as referring primarily to the role of the father in the household. Sargon could have made himself look like a proper academic. And again, I found this definition just by Googling for academic definitions of patriarchy, and J. Ann Tickner is a respected and well-known feminist, so this would have been much more compelling than these random people. It's like all the kudos of actually reading dozens of books on feminism with none of the effort. But instead of something helpful, you've just talked about the dictionary and some random feminists who aren't particularly prominent, two of which are just YouTubers. I was actually planning on going through some of the other definitions I found online to give a broader impression of the various understandings of patriarchy and academic feminism, but honestly, this is a pretty great definition and it was the first option I found. I will, however, give a definition by Sylvia Wolby in Theorizing Patriarchy, because, the book's called Theorizing Patriarchy. You don't write a book with that title unless you have a pretty comprehensive definition of patriarchy.
Before developing the details of its forms, I shall define patriarchy as a system of social structures and practices in which men dominate, oppress, and exploit women. The use of the term social structure is important here, since it clearly implies rejection of both biological determinism and the notion that every individual man is in a dominant position and every woman in a subordinate one. Patriarchy is composed of 6 structures: the patriarchal mode of production, patriarchal relations in work, patriarchal relations in the state, male violence, patriarchal relations in sexuality, and patriarchal relations in cultural institutions.
It then goes on to elaborate on those 6 structures, but I guess you'll just have to buy the book if you want that. But anyway, that is quite possibly your last drop of rigid academia for the day, because now we're just going to let Sargon talk.
So the most direct description of patriarchy I found was on everydayfeminism.com.
Okay, that's an alright source. At least it's a popular feminist blog site.
This definition is wonderfully concise and tells us absolutely everything we need to know about the feminist perception of the patriarchy, or at least this feminist's perception of the patriarchy. This definition has a decidedly Marxist slant.
Yes, some feminists are Marxists and incorporate Marxist theories into their feminism. This is a debate in academic feminism. It's one of the several debates regarding how different theoretical frameworks will determine how one views the oppression of women. Honestly though, Sargon, you don't really need to worry about that, because you're not a feminist. All you need to worry about is the broadest definition, that patriarchy refers to an inequality between men and women in terms of power, wealth, and cultural capital based on nothing other than inaccurate and discriminatory societal notions about gender. Yes, feminist academics who care a lot about theories and nuances are going to be talking about how patriarchy should be understood in the strictest sense for a long time, but it doesn't really concern you, and certainly doesn't do anything to discredit the integrity of the broader and more unified feminist understanding of patriarchy. You'll notice that I've given up trying to get Sargon to engage the feminist literature, and instead just to shut up about complex feminist topics, because it's one or the other, either bone up or shut up, as the kids are saying.
So finally, let's try Wikipedia.
I approve of using Wikipedia. At least Wikipedia tends to cite sources.
Maybe they have some kind of definition of patriarchy that we can use. A definition that actually reflects reality.
Something you'll notice is that Sargon is sort of arguing backwards, or rather, he has made a series of bad arguments to show that women aren't oppressed, and now he's dismissing definitions of patriarchy that claim women are oppressed, and saying that they don't reflect reality. So the argument of the video isn't even that patriarchy is wrong, rather that was premise 1 of the video. Premise 1 is that women are not victims of societal oppression because of all the statistics Sargon showed, and premise 2 is that the definition which doesn't reflect reality is incoherent, and therefore all feminist definitions of patriarchy are incoherent, therefore feminism is incoherent, which is a bizarre argument, not least because a really important claim, indeed a claim that would single-handedly defeat feminism, is simply casually presented as the first premise. It's like if I said, if you want to understand transubstantiation, you'd start off by looking at the dictionary, but we can tell from Google that wine doesn't turn into blood, so maybe we should try to find a definition of transubstantiation that actually fits with reality. It seems like Catholics are unable to come up with one. Aren't they stupid, those Catholics?
How could a patriarchy be subtle? It enforces gender roles. It ensures domination of women by men. Not just how, but why would it operate and manifest in casual ways that tend to go unnoticed?
So this is when we return back to that definition of patriarchy given by Gerda Lerner in The Creation of Patriarchy.
Patriarchy, in its wider definition, means the manifestation and institutionalization of male dominance over women and children in the family, and the extension of male dominance over women in society in general. It does not imply that women are either totally powerless or totally deprived of rights, influence, and resources. One of the most challenging tasks of women's history is to trace with precision the various forms and modes in which patriarchy appears historically, the shifts and changes in its structure and function, and the adaptations it makes to female pressure and demands.
This definition pretty much answers Sargon's question. Patriarchy can be subtle because the power of one group over another can be subtle. If 2 people work the same job and I decide to give one worker a penny extra a day, based on absolutely no reason other than that they are white and the other worker is black, that's an injustice. Yes, it's an injustice of 1 penny difference, but it's still unjust. And it's certainly subtle. Feminism would still be right and Sargon would still be wrong, even if the sex-based oppression of women amounted to 1 penny's difference between women and men spread out over a whole lifetime, because it would still be an inequality based on nothing other than gender. So yes, if we define patriarchy as simply an inequality between men and women in terms of power, wealth, and cultural capital based on nothing other than inaccurate and discriminatory societal notions about gender, then yes, patriarchy can be subtle, because even the smallest inequality would still be a patriarchy. Now, in practice, the inequality can be much more significant, indeed it is, and still be subtle. This is because of a few other factors that contribute to the subtlety of patriarchy. Firstly, because patriarchy can coexist with other oppression that makes patriarchy hard to detect. For example, most people don't think about how women were oppressed in the antebellum US South because it's not going to be the main focus. This principle applies in any society where multiple forms of oppression exist. There's a very good chance that people will focus on those below them in the totem pole, not focusing on their own oppression. Like, the woman at a Nazi rally is still an oppressed victim of patriarchy, but she isn't focusing on that when she's too busy being angry at non-white people for, existing. Secondly, patriarchy has to do with how we are raised. This should be kind of obvious, but how you are raised affects the person you become, and the amount of gender reveals I see just casually scrolling through Facebook tells me that the gender of their child matters to parents. If it matters enough to burn down a forest because they wanted to have a bonfire that would burn pink flames, then it matters enough for the way that they'll treat their son instead of their daughter to affect who that child ends up being. And honestly, I could cite all sorts of studies showing how women being exposed to more stereotypically female content prior to taking exams will cause them to have worse results. But I shouldn't even need to, because if you're a human being who's been living on this planet for any significant amount of time, you shouldn't need studies to tell you that parents treat boys and girls differently, and how you're treated as a boy or a girl will affect who you become as a man or a woman. Thirdly, many times women will be told that they actually have more more power than men, because they control lots of really important stuff. And we know this happens because in this very video we have Sargon pointing to the fact that women tend to be left with the immensely tedious task of grocery shopping, and saying that this proves women have power. Imagine that, but like, every time it happens over the course of a woman's life. Most people who think about it for half a second can see that Sargon's "women do the groceries so they have the power" argument is stupid. But what about people saying that women have the important job of taking care of the next generation? That's going to appeal to a lot of women. And this leads me on to the fourth and final point. The problem with patriarchy isn't always that it's objectively awful on an individual level. Indeed, many women, when it comes down to it, like living in a patriarchy, especially if they're shielded from the worst aspects of it. For example, I enjoy cooking. I don't mind having to cook most meals, and I expect that when I get married I will do most of the cooking. It's not inconceivable to me that a woman might also enjoy doing the cooking. I might just about be able to imagine a woman enjoying shopping for groceries. The point is not that these jobs are horrible, awful jobs that nobody should ever be subject to. The point is that disproportionately they are seen to be women's work. On an individual basis there isn't a problem. In an absolute vacuum there is nothing wrong with the most patriarchal household imaginable. Why? Because we don't know if this is just a particular man and that particular woman. Maybe in the house down the street there is a matriarchal household where the husband typically defers to the woman. The problem is we know that in most houses, and in society at large, it is the men who are dominant. Sargon has already told us that men control 80% of the US government. Therefore, we have to ask why. And we may find that the answer is because of society's false and discriminatory ideas about gender, and that's a problem.
Not just how, but why would it operate and manifest in casual ways that tend to go unnoticed?
The why question is much easier to answer than the how question. Sargon clearly got his stresses the wrong way around here, because usually you start off with the easy question and then say, and not just that, but, and then you ask the hard question. Silly Sargon. So why would patriarchy be subtle? Well, to help demonstrate the argument, consider the fact that Sargon has not in this video endorsed patriarchy. Indeed, there is no reason to conclude from anything Sargon has said, to my knowledge, that Sargon would not be opposed to a genuine Victorian level patriarchy where women aren't allowed to vote. I mean, I'm sure if he existed at that time, then he'd be all for it and actively justifying it. But modern day Sargon's arguments in this video is not patriarchy is a good thing, but rather what feminists are describing is not a true patriarchy, because a true patriarchy would be direct and undeniable oppression of women, which of course would be bad. And there's the rub. Sargon of Akkad, one of the most prominent anti-feminist angry men on YouTube, will still at least claim that he'd be against a genuine, undeniably obvious patriarchy. So if rabid anti-feminists are against an obvious, direct and unmistakable patriarchy, could you imagine the response from progressives and actual women? Such a patriarchy would be very short-lived. And that's why patriarchy is an obvious, direct and unmistakable, because if it was, it would not exist. This is also a good moment to point out that no feminist I know of believes that patriarchy is an actual conspiracy that is consciously orchestrated by a group of men somewhere. Rather, patriarchy is about the reluctance of individual men to give up their privilege. A lot of the time, men won't even think of it as discriminating against women, but simply common sense, or the natural order of how things are supposed to be. Being against obvious patriarchy doesn't automatically mean somebody will be against more subtle patriarchy. Just think about how many male feminists there are who perpetuate patriarchy. They're perfectly keen to call out the patriarchy they perceive, yet they often fail to check their own patriarchal attitudes.
But this I find to be the most revealing statement. And women aren't the only ones who suffer under patriarchy. Everyone does, because patriarchy demands that those in power conform to a specific set of rules, ones that require the suppression of feelings and include a lack of empathy. They go on to say that patriarchy demands that those being ruled play by a certain set of rules as well. They are the controlled ones. While they are allowed to show emotion, they cannot step outside of their prescribed boxes. They are not allowed to act assertively or attempt to gain authority.
Why do you find this to be the most revealing statement? He doesn't explain why. Revealing of what? I'm so confused. Did you cut out your response to this passage? Because I didn't.
We know that the patriarchy is not preventing women from attaining money, power, or status.
We definitely don't know that, and you haven't even come close to showing it. You have shown that some women can attain these things. What you haven't shown is that there aren't women who would have otherwise achieved these things were it not for patriarchy, which would mean they were prevented from getting them. And by the way, this fifth point alone would totally destroy feminism. Again, we have Sargon presenting a claim that would totally destroy feminism, and yet inexplicably not making that the main focus of his video.
While being oppressed by the fact that they are queer, disabled, and female. I don't mean to laugh, but they are putting the fact that someone's homosexual and female in the same category as being disabled.
Saying somebody is disabled isn't an insult, so not sure why it should bother women to be compared to disabled people, especially since this is about the oppression group's experience, and disabled groups are oppressed.
And so the use of the term Patriarchy is therefore better, as it demands we take other forms of oppression into account, as well as the privileges. What the feminists have finally discovered, in discovering the Patriarchy, can be summed up in the phrase, "You take the rough with the smooth," otherwise known to everyone else on Earth as real life. Yes, in some ways you will have disadvantages. Yes, in other ways you will have advantages. Yes, you may well not enjoy some of the things you have to do, but you will enjoy some of the other things that you are able to do.
Here's the thing, it's not about the consequences really, it's about the principle, it's about justice. If I get hit by a bus and die, that sucks. It sucks worse than a woman not getting a promotion instead of her less qualified male co-worker. However, me getting hit by a bus is not an injustice, except in some kind of karmic spiritual sense. There is nothing to fight against there. Meanwhile, a woman being passed up for a promotion based on her gender is an injustice, and there is something to fight against there. Yes, we all experience good and bad things, but not everybody is subject to injustices, and simply saying to people suffering from injustices that they need to take the rough with the smooth is really not very smart.
Now, let me introduce you to a feminist called Camille Paglia.
Why do you do this, Sargon? Why do you make it so obvious that you don't care about actually representing feminism? You've spent this whole time talking about YouTubers, Wikipedia, feminist blog posts, but when you come to an obscure brand of post-feminism, you suddenly have an intimate knowledge of its most popular literary advocate. Where was this when you were talking about literally everything else you've spoken about?
For example, the Muso tribe of China, a member of whom is pictured here performing agriculture with a hand tool, and the Khasi people of northern India, who live in a state of such abject impoverishment that people visit them to marvel at the lack of trash. These are what matriarchies look like.
Okay, so Sargon actually unironically suggests that if women are in charge, society fails. But he has really bad logic. He suggests that because many societies where women are dominant are very primal, it follows that female leadership stagnates growth. Meanwhile, if he actually showed feminism the courtesy he showed anti-feminism, and bothered to inform himself about it, he'd know that feminists have for a long time held that patriarchal notions evolved out of societal developments like private property, individual families as opposed to communal living, and bartering. So yes, of course, matriarchies won't be as developed because we know that it was the development of societies that caused the advent of patriarchy, not the other way around. Indeed, Sargon is totally off base here because we know that many prehistoric societies were matriarchal, and there's a reason why they aren't all around today. Because they developed and became patriarchal. I'm going to have to contract this history slightly, so I'd recommend reading Gerda Lerner's 2 books on this subject, but here's a basic explanation. In prehistoric times, the most valuable resource was children, because children represented labour. Since monogamy was not strictly enforced, and the role of the man in reproduction was not immediately apparent, women were considered to be the owners of their children, and hence they controlled the surplus labour produced. Meanwhile, spirituality centred on humanity's mutual and respectful relationship with the earth. This was at a time when humanity had a mutual relationship with nature and was still very much a part of the circle of life. They were predators themselves, but also prey. They ate from the earth, but only what the earth gave them. Women were seen as representative of nature. The reproduction cycle of the woman and the birth of new life made women seem like a direct connection to the immanence of nature. However, as technology began to advance, a few things happened. Firstly, it became possible for more complex industries to develop, and with this came bartering and eventually currency. Wealth was not tied up with the reproduction of children, but instead with the ability to perform manual labour. As sophisticated property relations developed, society began to fracture up into individual households, and suddenly the man could know that the children he had with his wife were his. Meanwhile, nature became subject to man. Much of what I'm saying here is a synthesis of de Beauvoir and Lerner, and since it would be a crime to mention de Beauvoir and not quote her, here's a summation of these events.
Little by little, man mediated his experience, and in his representations, as in his practical existence, the male principle triumphed. Spirit prevailed over life, transcendence over immanence, technology over magic, and reason over superstition. The devaluation of woman represents a necessary stage in the history of humanity, for she derived her prestige not from her positive value but from man's weakness. She incarnated disturbing natural mysteries. Man escapes her grasp when he frees himself from nature. In passing from stone to bronze, he is able to conquer the land through his work and conquer himself as well.
Which is to say, man's relationship with nature was no longer mutual. Rather, with a bronze axe, he could chop down a tree, build a fence, and establish a claim over a piece of land. That is to say, the consequence of private property was that man could destroy nature, manipulate nature, and control nature. And heretofore, women had been understood as representative of nature. And from there, things would then develop further. Collective wisdom changed from understanding women as the origin of life to understanding man as the origin of life, who animates the dead flesh within the woman that is ejected in a bloody mess if not for the man's life-giving seed. From the notion of man as a life-giver came the idea of a masculine god, sovereign creator of the universe who created the material out of the spiritual, and rather naturally, the world over, a society that viewed women as the primary property owners, the source of life, and the nexus of the divine, became a society that viewed men as the primary property owners, the source of life, and the nexus of the divine. Now, Sargon might point out that this is a generalization, which is undeniable. He may go further and say that this is totally baseless speculation, worthy of no real consideration at all. To that I'd say, read de Beauvoir and learn it if you like. Engels also has his famous book on this subject, which I could quote, but I think we get the point. Still, until I make a substantial video on this topic, preceded by a considerable research project, I won't be able to confidently say that this is 100% how sexism came to exist. This does, however, show that Sargon's argument is faulty. Sargon claims that matriarchal societies can't succeed, while patriarchal societies can. However, presented here is an alternative view, where a society's attitude towards gender are not determinants of society's progress, but rather consequences of society's progress. And this would perfectly demonstrate why it is that many modern tribal societies are still matriarchal, whereas the matriarchal societies that did develop and did progress became patriarchal. So Sargon's argument, sans any expansion on his part, is faulty.
You are complaining about the meritocracy. You are complaining about a system that allows anyone who works hard, anyone with the predisposition to produce results, to rise to the top, where they rightfully belong.
What a loser. Like, this is the most naive thing I've ever heard, and it's honestly so sad. He actually thinks he lives in the meritocracy. He actually believes that this is a society where the hardest working people who contribute the most to society rise to the top. It's like hearing a fully grown man confidently talking about the idiots who think that Santa Claus isn't real.
Feminists are lazy, which is why instead of engaging with the meritocracy, joining a STEM field and producing results of their own, they do gender studies courses instead, because gender studies doesn't involve any hard work.
This to me speaks to a real problem with Sargon's existence on this planet, more specifically his YouTube channel. See, gender studies is hard work. It's not a lazy pursuit. It involves reading huge amounts of literature, and reading is hard work. Case in point, when I was approaching the end of university, I still had dozens of books that I had taken out from the library and that I knew I would need to return before the end of the year. So I began reading 500 pages of literature a day, just grinding for pretty much all of my spare time. This was after exams, so I had loads of time. Now, after this was all over, I stopped reading and something happened. I started to get fat. See, for a lot of my time at university, I had been eating 2 breakfasts, lunch, a protein shake dinner, and then a sandwich before going to bed. The amount of exertion from reading these books was enough that I was consuming many more calories than I ordinarily would, and when I stopped reading, those calories had nowhere to go and I started to get fat. The point here is that reading is hard work. Most humanities subjects involve a lot of reading, and if you've never sat down and tried to read a book all the way through in one sitting, which isn't an uncommon experience for people who have studied more literature-oriented degrees, then you are in no position to say that it isn't hard work. And I don't think that STEM is particularly hard work, or at least no harder than most other pursuits. Now, Sargon could say that STEM degrees are more useful than gender studies, not that STEM studies require more hard work, but that the results of this hard work are more profitable. And I'd agree with this. At the end of the day, I'd rather have the internet than a book on the Marxist feminist encounter. I'd rather have life-saving MRI machines than a book on the phenomenology of living as a woman. The thing is, I don't have to choose, so this is a moot point. The best analogy I can give here would be to theology. For all atheists, theology must be a rather pointless exercise, delineating the precise nature of a non-existent being, and more militant atheists even get frustrated at the existence of theology as an academic discipline. I remember an interview on a YouTube channel about philosophy, where a theologian was interviewed, and an atheist had commented basically saying that a theologian shouldn't even be considered an academic. The thing is, I do understand why an atheist might feel this way. Thousands of man-hours spent on theology is in their mind wasted effort, but it's still hard work. And frankly, if somebody is going to say that any academic pursuit doesn't involve hard work, that says more about them than it does about the particular branch of academia they're criticizing. Because if they weren't lazy and actually bothered to educate themselves on the topic they're getting paid thousands of Patreon dollars to talk about, then they'd understand that getting educated on any topic is hard work. And if you don't get educated, then you end up looking like an idiot. Anyway, so that's that. A few things. Firstly, even a small amount of money on Patreon does translate to me being more motivated to spend more time producing the best quality videos I can. As much as I made fun of Sargon for believing we live in a meritocracy, it definitely is true that actually getting something for your hard work does make that hard work more rewarding. However, more importantly than Patreon would be getting these videos out there, and that's absolutely free. Share it on Facebook, send it to your feminist friends or even your anti-feminist friends, and post it to your Twitters. Because these videos contain Sargon's central thesis, that feminism is wrong. And when these videos are so easy to respond to, it seems a shame that there isn't a popular series that has dealt with them. Something which I would love to do, which I suspect will never happen, is to debate Sargon. However, the best way to make sure this does happen is by making this response series popular. So do everything to make that happen. Like, comment, share and subscribe, all that good algorithm stuff. And final point, I have a film review channel which I operate with my friend, where we do a lot of in-depth film reviews, and I also have a channel where I talk about religion, wasting my time pointlessly looking at theology. Until then, bye. Big thank you to Princess XX for helping with the quotes, reading them out, and if anybody else would like to help me with that in the future, then get in contact with me on Twitter or in the comment section of this YouTube video. Thank you. Thank you to my current patrons, Eric Hernandez, Getting Off Podcast, Hannah Taylor, Kirsten, LRX89, Stephen and Thz. You're all very appreciated.
Do it! Just do it! Yes, you can!